There's nothing that can prepare a father for the moment his child is taken from him. The empty swing on the front porch, the silence where laughter used to be. It's a pain that cuts deeper than any bullet ever could. In the town of Bitter Creek, Owen Blackthorne was known as a gentle giant, a man who stood 7 feet tall but spoke softly to horses and read bedtime stories to his 12-year-old daughter Bethany Rose. For years, folks saw him as nothing more than a quiet widower who broke wild mustangs for honest pay. They had no idea that Owen Blackthorne was once the most feared gunslinger in the territory. When desperate outlaws kidnapped his little girl for ransom money, they thought they were dealing with an easy mark. They were dead wrong. What this father did to get his daughter back didn't involve a single gunshot, but it shocked everyone who witnessed it. What would you do if someone took the most precious thing in your world? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Bitter Creek in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the dusty main street where shopkeepers swept their porches and dogs lazed in the growing warmth. Owen Blackthorne stood in his corral, his massive frame silhouetted against the sunrise as he worked with a spirited bay mare that had been giving the previous owner nothing but trouble for months. His movements were deliberate, patient, a man who understood that breaking a horse wasn't about dominance, but about earning trust. At 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out doorways, Owen commanded attention wherever he went. His hands, scarred from years of work, could snap a man's wrist without effort, yet they moved with surprising gentleness as he ran them along the mare's neck, whispering words of comfort in a voice as deep as distant thunder. The townspeople of Bitter Creek had grown accustomed to seeing him this way, quiet, methodical, speaking more to horses than to humans. "Papa, you're going to be late for breakfast again," came a voice from the front porch of the modest 2-story house that sat 50 yards from the corral. Bethany Rose Blackthorne, 12 years old, with her mother's auburn curls and her father's steady green eyes, stood with her hands on her hips in a perfect imitation of maternal authority that would have made her late mother smile. Owen turned toward his daughter, his weathered face softening into the gentle expression reserved only for her. "Just finishing up with Duchess here, little bird. She's almost ready to trust again." "You say that about every horse," Bethany called back, but there was warmth in her voice. She'd heard this conversation 100 times before, and it never got old. Watching her father work was like witnessing poetry in motion. The way he could calm the wildest mustang with nothing more than patience and understanding. The porch where Bethany stood held the accumulated memories of their life together. A wooden swing hung from thick rope, worn smooth by countless evenings spent watching sunsets and sharing stories. Potted herbs lined the railings, rosemary, thyme, and sage that Bethany tended with the same careful attention her father showed his horses. Inside the house, on the mantel above the stone fireplace, sat a worn leather Bible that had belonged to her mother, its pages filled with pressed flowers and handwritten notes in the margins. "Mrs. Kemp stopped by yesterday while you were in town," Bethany said, settling onto the swing. "She brought more of those molasses cookies and asked if you'd consider courting her daughter Agnes." Owen's deep laugh rumbled across the yard. "And what did you tell her? That you're too old and too stubborn for courting, and Agnes deserves better?" Bethany's eyes danced with mischief. "Then I ate 3 cookies and told her they were delicious." "Diplomatic as always," Owen said, giving the mare one final pat before heading toward the house. "Your mother would be proud." The mention of Catherine Blackthorne brought the familiar moment of quiet that always followed her name. She died when Bethany was barely walking, taken by fever during a particularly harsh winter when the doctor couldn't make it through the mountain passes. Owen had raised his daughter alone ever since, guided by the memory of his wife's gentle wisdom and the promises he'd made at her graveside. Inside their home, the kitchen table was set for 2, as it had been every morning for 11 years. Bethany had prepared eggs, bacon, and biscuits with the competence of someone far beyond her years. The routine was sacred to them both, a daily affirmation of the life they'd built together in this quiet corner of the world. "Sheriff Murdoch came by the other day," Bethany said as they ate. "He looked worried." Owen's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Did he say what about?" "Outlaws. There's been talk of a gang operating in the territory. The Crimson Ridge Boys, led by someone called Viper Kane." Bethany watched her father's face carefully. "Have you heard that name before?" For just a moment something flickered across Owen's features, a shadow of recognition, perhaps, or memory. But it passed so quickly Bethany might have imagined it. "Can't say I have," he replied, returning to his breakfast. "But Sheriff Murdoch's got good reason to be concerned. These mountain passes can hide all manner of trouble." After breakfast, Owen walked Bethany to the schoolhouse, as he did every morning when weather permitted. The other children greeted her with the easy familiarity of a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Her teacher, Miss Rachel Porter, nodded respectfully to Owen, the kind of acknowledgement reserved for men who commanded respect without demanding it. "I'll pick you up after lessons," Owen told his daughter, adjusting the blue silk ribbon that held back her curls. "We'll stop by Doc Patterson's. He's got a new foal he wants me to look at. Can we get peppermint sticks at Morrison's?" Bethany asked, already knowing the answer. "If you can recite your multiplication tables without a single mistake." "All the way to 12? "All the way to 12. Bethany grinned and disappeared into the schoolhouse, her laughter carrying on the morning breeze. Owen watched until she was safely inside, then made his way back toward home, nodding to the various townspeople he passed along the way. At the general store, old Herman Morrison was arranging goods in his window display. "Morning, Owen. Heard you've got that Peterson mare behaving herself now?" "She just needed to remember what it felt like to be treated with respect," Owen replied. "Amazing how much fight goes out of them when they realize you're not their enemy." "Wish the same could be said for outlaws," Morrison muttered, glancing toward the mountains. "Been hearing troubling stories from the trading posts. Men with no regard for decent folks just trying to make an honest living." Owen's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Trouble has a way of finding those who go looking for it. Best to keep our heads down and trust in the law." "Easy enough to say when you're built like a mountain," Morrison replied with a nervous laugh. "Some of us aren't quite so intimidating." As Owen continued his walk home, he passed the Silver Dollar Saloon, where early morning drinkers were already gathering. Through the batwing doors, he could see Maria Santos wiping down tables, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. She looked up as he passed, offering a slight nod of acknowledgement. Maria had arrived in Bitter Creek 5 years ago with enough money to buy the saloon outright and enough common sense to run it without causing trouble. She kept her ears open and her mouth shut, a combination that made her valuable in a frontier town. Back at his property, Owen spent the morning working with 3 more horses, each one requiring different approach and patience. The Peterson mare, Duchess, was responding well to gentle encouragement. A black stallion named Thunder needed firmer boundaries, while an old gelding simply required reassurance that his working days weren't over yet. The work was honest and satisfying, requiring the kind of focus that kept darker thoughts at bay. Owen had discovered long ago that horses didn't judge a man by his past. They only cared about who he was in the present moment. It was a philosophy he'd tried to embrace in his own life. Though some memories had claws that dug deep and refused to let go, around midday he noticed a dust cloud on the horizon, riders approaching from the east. 3 men on horseback, moving at an unhurried pace that suggested they weren't running from anything. Owen continued his work, but kept one eye on the approaching visitors. The men reined up at his fence line, and Owen recognized the lead rider immediately. Tobias Fletcher, a man from his past who'd chosen a different path when the killing stopped making sense. Tobias owned a small ranch about 30 miles south, raised cattle, and minded his own business. The fact that he'd ridden this far meant something was wrong. "Owen!" Tobias called out, dismounting and approaching the corral. "Got a minute?" "Always got time for you, Tobias." Owen secured the lead rope on the stallion and walked over to the fence. "What brings you all this way?" Heard some troubling news. Word is, Viper Kane and his boys are operating in these parts. Thought you should know. The name hung in the air between them, like smoke from a distant fire. Owen's expression remained carefully neutral, but his hands tightened on the fence rail. Appreciate the warning. I'll pass it along to Sheriff Murdoch. Owen, Tobias said quietly, glancing at his companions to ensure they were out of earshot. You know I've never been one to pry into a man's business. But if Kane's in the territory, and if he knows you're here, he's got no reason to know anything about me. Owen cut him off. I'm just a horse trainer now, Tobias. Been that way for over a decade. Some men have long memories, and some men have the good sense to let sleeping dogs lie. Tobias nodded, recognizing the finality in Owen's tone. Fair enough. But if you need anything at all, you know where to find me. After the visitors left, Owen found himself standing alone in his corral, staring at the mountains where shadows gathered in the late afternoon light. For 12 years, he'd lived quietly in Bitter Creek, raising his daughter and breaking horses. For 12 years, he'd managed to keep his past buried deeper than winter graves. But the mention of Viper Kane's name brought back memories he'd spent more than a decade trying to forget, memories of a time when Owen Blackthorne was known by a different name in very different circles when it came time to collect Bethany from school. Owen found her waiting on the front steps with her satchel and a drawing she'd made during art lessons. It was a picture of their house, complete with the front porch swing, and her father working with horses in the corral. It's beautiful, little bird, he said, studying the careful details she'd included. You captured it perfectly. Miss Porter says I have an artistic eye, Bethany replied proudly. She thinks I should keep drawing and maybe send some pictures to the newspaper in Denver. That's a fine idea. Your mother always said you had a gift for seeing the beauty in everyday things. They stopped at Doc Patterson's as promised, where Owen examined a week-old colt with a slight limp. After determining it was nothing more serious than a stone bruise that would heal with time, they made their way to Morrison's for the promised peppermint sticks, earned fair and square when Bethany rattled off her multiplication tables without a single error. As they walked home in the golden light of late afternoon, Bethany asked, Papa, do you ever miss the old days? Before we lived here, I mean. It was an innocent question from a child who knew almost nothing about her father's life before Bitter Creek. Owen had told her that he'd traveled a lot when he was younger, working different jobs, but had never shared the darker details of what those jobs had entailed. I miss your mother every day, he replied carefully. But these have been the best years of my life, little bird. This house, this town, it's everything I ever hoped for. Even when people try to get you to court Agnes Kemp. Owen's laugh was genuine this time, especially then. That evening, after Bethany had completed her homework and gone to bed, Owen sat alone on the front porch, smoking his pipe and listening to the sounds of night settling over Bitter Creek. In the distance, a coyote howled, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called to its mate. These were the sounds of peace, of a life lived without violence or fear, but in the back of his mind, the name Viper Kane echoed like a warning bell, and Owen found himself wondering if the peaceful life he'd built for himself and his daughter was about to be tested in ways he'd hoped never to face again. The swing beside him moved gently in the evening breeze, its rope creaking with the soft rhythm of countless nights spent in quiet contemplation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new horses to train, and another day of the simple, honest existence he'd chosen for himself and Bethany. For now, that was enough. It had to be. The morning started like any other, with Owen rising before dawn to tend to his horses, while Bethany prepared breakfast in the warm glow of lamplight. The routine was so familiar, so comforting in its predictability, that neither of them paid attention to the unusual silence that had settled over Bitter Creek during the night, the kind of silence that comes when even the animals sense danger lurking in the shadows. Owen had 3 horses to work with that day, including a particularly stubborn paint mare that had been giving him trouble all week. After breakfast, he kissed Bethany goodbye and watched her skip down the path towards school, her blue silk hair ribbon catching the morning sunlight like a beacon of innocence in a world that was about to turn dark. "I'll be back by noon," he called after her. "Mrs. Patterson asked me to look at her husband's old plow horse. Don't forget we're having stew tonight," Bethany called back. "I put the vegetables in the pot before I left. I won't forget, little bird." It was the last normal conversation they would have for a very long time. Owen spent the morning 3 miles outside town at the Patterson homestead, examining a 20-year-old gelding that had been favoring his left front leg. The diagnosis was simple: arthritis setting in, nothing that couldn't be managed with proper care and lighter work. He'd seen it countless times before in older horses, the inevitable consequence of years of faithful service. "He's got plenty of good years left in him," Owen assured Doc Patterson as they stood in the small paddock behind the house. "Just needs to take things a bit easier, like the rest of us when we get to a certain age." Patterson, a man in his 60s with thinning grey hair and gentle eyes, nodded gratefully. "Margaret will be relieved to hear it. She's had that horse since he was a colt, and she'd be heartbroken if we had to put him down." The ride back to Bitter Creek should have taken 30 minutes, but Owen found himself taking his time, enjoying the crisp mountain air and the way the afternoon light played across the valley floor. It was one of those perfect autumn days that reminded a man why he'd chosen to make his home in such a place: peaceful, beautiful, and far removed from the violence and chaos of the outside world. The first sign that something was wrong came when he crested the hill that overlooked his property. The front door of his house stood wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze, like a mouth gasping for air. Owen's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Bethany was meticulous about closing doors, a habit he'd drilled into her from childhood. She would never leave the house open like that, not willingly. He spurred his horse into a gallop, covering the remaining distance in minutes that felt like hours. As he drew closer, he could see that the vegetable garden had been trampled, the carefully tended rows of carrots and potatoes crushed under the hooves of multiple horses. The front porch, usually so neat and welcoming, was scattered with overturned furniture and broken pottery. Owen dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his massive frame moving with surprising speed as he bounded up the porch steps. The scene inside the house struck him like a physical blow. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled out and emptied, his wife's precious Bible thrown carelessly on the floor with some of its pressed flowers scattered like fallen leaves. "Bethany," he called out, his deep voice echoing through the violated sanctuary of their home. "Bethany, where are you?" Only silence answered him. He searched every room with growing desperation, calling his daughter's name until his throat was raw. Her bedroom had been ransacked, clothes pulled from the wardrobe and strewn across the floor. Her schoolbooks lay scattered and torn, pages ripped from their bindings in a display of casual cruelty that spoke to the kind of men who would terrorize a child's home. It was on his way back, through the front room, that Owen spotted something that made his heart stop entirely. There, caught on a splinter of wood near the doorframe, hung a torn piece of blue silk, the same ribbon that had been in Bethany's hair when she'd skipped off to school that morning. The fabric was stained with what looked like dirt, or perhaps something darker. With trembling hands, Owen freed the ribbon from the splinter and held it up to the light. It was definitely Bethany's. He'd bought it for her on her last birthday, and she'd worn it every day since. The fact that it was torn, that part of it was missing, told him everything he needed to know about how she'd been taken from this place. A white piece of paper on the floor caught his attention. It had been weighted down with a stone, clearly intended to be found. Owen picked it up with hands that shook despite his efforts to remain calm, and read words that carved themselves into his soul like acid. "Blackthorn, we got you, girl. $5,000 in gold or she dies slow. You got 3 days to get the money. Come alone to Devil's Canyon at sunset on Friday. No law, no guns, no tricks, or we start sending pieces back. You know who this is. VK." The note was unsigned, except for those initials, but Owen knew exactly who had written it. Viper Kane, a name that belonged to nightmares Owen had thought were buried forever. The fact that Cain had found him here, in this quiet corner of the world where he'd tried so hard to disappear, meant that his past had finally caught up with him in the most terrible way imaginable. Owen sank into the one chair that hadn't been overturned, the weight of realization crushing down on him like a landslide. $5,000 in gold was more money than most people in Bitter Creek would see in a lifetime. It was an impossible sum, clearly chosen not because Cain expected to collect it, but because he wanted Owen to suffer the knowledge that his daughter would die for crimes committed. More than a decade ago, the torn ribbon fell from his fingers as memories flooded back, memories of the man he used to be before Catherine, before Bethany, before he'd found the strength to walk away from violence and death. In those days, he'd been known by a different name in very different circles. They'd called him the Phantom then, and his reputation had been built on fear and the kind of swift, brutal justice that left no room for mercy or second chances. Viper Cain had been there at the end, during Owen's last job as a gun for hire. It had been a cattle war down in Texas, with big money on both sides and blood flowing like water after a spring rain. Owen had been hired to protect a ranch owner's family, but Cain had been working for the other side, leading a group of hired killers who specialized in making examples out of anyone who stood in their way. The job had gone wrong in the worst possible way. A child had died, a little girl about Bethany's age who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time when the shooting started. Owen could still see her face in his nightmares, could still remember the weight of her lifeless body when he'd carried her back to her mother's arms. It was that moment, that terrible realization of what his life had become, that had made him hang up his guns forever. Cain had blamed Owen for ruining the job, for choosing to protect innocent people instead of completing the mission. Their last confrontation had ended with Cain wounded and swearing revenge, but Owen had thought the man was dead. Apparently, he'd been wrong. Now Cain had taken the one thing in the world that mattered more to Owen than his own life. The message was clear. This wasn't about money. It was about payback for old grievances, a settling of accounts that had been years in the making. Owen stood slowly, his massive frame unfolding like a mountain coming to life. He looked around the destroyed remnants of the peaceful home he'd built for himself and his daughter, seeing it now as if for the first time. The broken furniture could be replaced, the scattered books could be gathered up, but the innocence that had been shattered here could never be restored. He picked up his wife's Bible from the floor, carefully collecting the pressed flowers that had fallen from its pages. As he did, his fingers brushed against the loose board beneath the mantelpiece, a hiding place he'd hoped never to disturb again. The board lifted easily, revealing a cloth-wrapped bundle that hadn't seen daylight in over 12 years. Inside the cloth was a gun belt and holster, crafted from the finest leather and worn smooth by years of use. The weapon it housed was a Colt .45 Peacemaker with an ivory grip, perfectly balanced and maintained despite its years of storage. Owen hefted the gun, feeling its familiar weight in his palm, remembering skills he'd hoped to forget forever. But even as his fingers closed around the grip, he found himself thinking of the promises he'd made to his dying wife, to his young daughter, to himself. He'd sworn off violence, pledged to raise Bethany in a world where problems were solved with words and patience rather than bullets and blood. The man who'd once been called the Phantom had died in that Texas cattle war, replaced by a peaceful horse trainer who believed in redemption and second chances. Yet here he stood, holding the tools of his former trade, facing a choice that would define not only his future, but his daughter's as well. 3 days to find $5,000 in gold, or watch the most precious thing in his world die at the hands of a man who'd been nursing a grudge for over a decade. Owen wrapped the gun belt back in its cloth and returned it to its hiding place. Whatever Cain wanted, whatever game he was playing, Owen wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing the Phantom return. There had to be another way. There was always another way for a man willing to think instead of just shoot. But as he stood in the ruins of his peaceful home, holding his daughter's torn ribbon in his trembling hands, Owen Blackthorne began to understand that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. No matter how deep you dig the grave, the sun was setting by the time he finally left the house, locking the door behind him, though it seemed pointless now. As he walked toward town to report the kidnapping to Sheriff Murdoch, Owen's mind was already working, analyzing the situation from every angle. Kane wanted him to suffer, wanted him to feel helpless and desperate. That meant he'd keep Bethany alive, at least for now. She was worth more to him as leverage than as a corpse. 3 days. It wasn't much time, but it would have to be enough. Owen had resources Kane didn't know about, connections from his old life that might prove useful in ways the outlaw couldn't anticipate. The man who'd taken his daughter thought he was dealing with a broken-down horse trainer, but he was about to discover that some skills, once learned, are never truly forgotten. The game had begun, and Owen Blackthorne was already planning his next move. Sheriff Roy Murdoch was a good man, caught in an impossible situation. At 53, he'd been keeping the peace in Bitter Creek for nearly 2 decades, handling everything from drunken cowboys to claim disputes with a steady hand and common sense. But as he sat behind his desk, listening to Owen's report, the color drained from his weathered face like water from a broken dam. 5,000 in gold, Murdoch repeated, shaking his head slowly. Owen, that's more money than this entire town sees in a year. Even if we could raise it, there's no guarantee they'd honor their word. I know that, Owen replied, his deep voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. I'm not asking the town to pay ransom money. I'm asking you what resources you have to help me get my daughter back. Murdoch stood and walked to the window overlooking Main Street, where the evening shadows were growing longer. I've got myself, my deputy Pete, who's barely 20 and has never drawn his gun in anger, and maybe a dozen men in town who know which end of a rifle shoots. Against Viper Kane, and however many riders he's got with him. How many men does Kane typically run with? Reports vary. Some say 6 or 7, others put it closer to 15. Murdoch turned back to Owen, his expression grim. What I can tell you is that every single one of them is wanted for murder, robbery, or worse. These aren't desperate men making bad choices. Owen, they're killers who've chosen this life because they enjoy the work. Owen absorbed this information with the calm calculation of a man accustomed to weighing odds and planning strategy. Even if Kane only had half a dozen men, they would be experienced fighters who knew how to use violence as both weapon and tool. Sheriff Murdoch was right to be concerned about the law's ability to handle such a situation. There's something else, Murdoch continued, returning to his desk. Word came down from the territorial marshal last week. Kane's gang hit a bank in Silverton 2 months ago, killed 3 people, including a child. There's a federal bounty on his head now, dead or alive. The mention of another dead child struck Owen like a physical blow, bringing back memories of that day in Texas when everything had gone wrong. He could see Bethany's face in his mind, frightened and alone, at the mercy of men who thought nothing of killing innocents to make a point. I need to know everything you can tell me about Kane's methods, Owen said. Where he strikes, how he operates, what kind of places he uses for hideouts. Murdoch pulled a thick folder from his desk drawer, spreading wanted posters and witness reports across the surface like a dealer laying out cards. He's smart, I'll give him that. Never hits the same area twice in a row, never stays in one place long enough for posses to track him down. His gang moves through the mountains like ghosts, using old mining camps and abandoned settlements as temporary bases. Owen studied the papers, noting the careful descriptions of Kane's methods. The outlaw was indeed intelligent, smart enough to know that staying mobile was the key to survival in a territory where law enforcement was spread thin across vast distances. There's something else, Murdoch said quietly. 3 different witnesses have described Kane asking specifically about you, Owen, not by name, but by description. A giant of a man who works with horses, lives alone with his daughter. He's been planning this for a while. The revelation settled over Owen like a cold mountain mist. This wasn't a random kidnapping for ransom. It was a carefully orchestrated trap designed to draw him out. Kane had been watching, waiting, learning the rhythms of Owen's life until he knew exactly when and how to strike for maximum impact. If he's been planning this, then he knows I don't have $5,000, Owen said. Which means the ransom demand is just part of a larger game. What kind of game? Owen didn't answer immediately. How could he explain to this decent, law-abiding man that some conflicts went deeper than money or territory? That some grudges burned for years like underground fires, waiting for the right moment to burst into flame and consume everything in their path? The kind where winning means more than just getting the money, Owen finally replied. As they talked, the sheriff's office door opened and Tobias Fletcher stepped inside, his hat in his hands and concern written across his lined face. "Owen, I just heard. I'm sorry. If there's anything I can do—" "Appreciate it, Tobias," Owen replied, though his attention remained focused on the papers scattered across Murdoch's desk. "Right now, I need information more than anything else." Tobias glanced at Sheriff Murdoch, then back at Owen. "Maybe we should talk privately. Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of the sheriff." Owen replied, "I'm not so sure about that." Tobias's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "What I have to say involves things that happened before you came to Bitter Creek, things that might be better left in the past." Owen looked up from the wanted posters, meeting his old friend's eyes with a steady gaze. After a moment, he nodded to Sheriff Murdoch. "Roy, would you mind giving us a few minutes?" Murdoch hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with being excluded from a conversation about a crime in his jurisdiction. But something in Owen's expression convinced him not to argue. "I'll be next door getting coffee. Take all the time you need." When they were alone, Tobias closed the door and pulled a chair close to Owen's. "How much does he know?" he asked, nodding toward the door. "Nothing that matters. And how much are you planning to tell him?" "As little as possible." Owen leaned back in his chair, studying his old friend's worried expression. "What's on your mind, Tobias?" "I've been asking around since I left your place yesterday. Quiet-like, you understand. Talking to people who might have heard things, seen things. The kind of people who notice when strangers pass through their territory. And Kane's got 8 men with him, all of them experienced killers. They're holed up somewhere in the Devil's Canyon area, which makes sense, given where they want to meet you. But here's the thing, Owen. They've been there for almost 2 weeks. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment job. Owen absorbed this information with growing unease. 2 weeks meant Kane had been watching his routine, learning his schedule, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It also meant the outlaw had chosen his hideout with care, picking a location that would give him tactical advantages when the final confrontation came. "There's more," Tobias continued. "I talked to a man who knows a man who saw them setting up camp. Kane's got your daughter, all right, but he's not treating her like a typical hostage. No cage, no chains. She's being held in what used to be the main cabin of an old mining operation, with 2 men always on guard. That doesn't sound like Kane." "No, it doesn't, unless he's planning something that requires her to be in good condition when the time comes." The implications of this statement hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Owen had hoped that Kane would keep Bethany safe as long as she was valuable as leverage. But the careful treatment suggested something more complex and potentially more dangerous. "Owen," Tobias said quietly, "I know you've been trying to put the old days behind you. I know you made promises to Catherine and to yourself. But if you're going to get Bethany back alive, you might need to remember who you used to be." "I remember perfectly well who I used to be," Owen replied, his voice carrying an edge of steel that hadn't been there moments before. "The question is whether that man can accomplish what needs doing without becoming a monster in the process." Tobias reached into his jacket and pulled out a cloth bundle, placing it carefully on the desk between them. "I brought you something. Figured you might have put yours away somewhere and might not want to dig it up." Owen unwrapped the bundle to reveal a gun belt and holster, well-maintained but showing signs of years of hard use. The weapon inside was a Remington 44, its walnut grip worn smooth by countless hours of practice and use. Tobias Before you say anything, just listen. I'm not trying to turn you back into something you don't want to be. But Cain sure as hell isn't going to be impressed by your horse training skills. Sometimes a man has to use the tools God gave him, even if he'd rather they stayed in the toolbox. Owen stared at the weapon without touching it. For over a decade, he'd kept his own guns hidden away, symbols of a life he'd chosen to abandon. The sight of another man's iron brought back memories of weight and balance, of the split-second timing that meant the difference between life and death in a world where mercy was often seen as weakness. I made promises. Tobias, to a woman who's been dead for over a decade, and to a version of yourself that might not survive what's coming. Tobias leaned forward, his voice urgent. Catherine would want Bethany to live, Owen. She'd want her daughter to have the chance to grow up, to have children of her own, to experience all the things that make life worth living. If that means you have to break a promise to a ghost, then so be it. Sheriff Murdoch's footsteps on the wooden sidewalk announced his return. Tobias quickly rewrapped the gun belt and tucked it back inside his jacket. Think about what I said, Owen. Some battles can't be won with good intentions and peaceful words. When Murdoch returned, he found them discussing the geography of Devil's Canyon and the best approaches to the abandoned mining claims scattered throughout the area. It was the kind of practical conversation men might have about any number of legitimate reasons for traveling through dangerous country. I'll put together a posse, Murdoch said, settling back behind his desk. Every able-bodied man in town who can sit a horse and shoot straight. We can be ready to ride by tomorrow afternoon. I appreciate the offer, Roy, but Cain was clear about coming alone. If he sees a posse, Bethany dies. Then what do you propose? That you ride out there by yourself and hope for the best. Owen stood slowly, his massive frame unfolding like a mountain coming to life. I propose to get my daughter back, whatever it takes. The how of it is something I'll figure out along the way. As he walked toward the door, Tobias caught his arm. Owen, the offer stands. Whatever you need, however you need it. You're not in this alone. I know, and I'm grateful for it. But as Owen stepped out into the gathering darkness of Bitter Creek's main street, he felt more alone than he had since the day Catherine died. Somewhere in the mountains, his daughter was counting on him to save her, and the only tools that might prove adequate for the job were ones he'd sworn never to use again. The empty swing on his front porch creaked in the evening breeze as he walked past, a sound that would haunt his dreams for as long as this nightmare continued. Dawn came too early and not soon enough. Owen had spent the night sitting on his front porch, staring at the empty swing and trying to formulate a plan that didn't involve becoming the man he'd sworn never to be again. The torn piece of blue silk ribbon lay across his palm like an accusation, its frayed edges catching the first light of morning. He'd been awake for 36 hours straight, but sleep seemed as distant as the mountains where his daughter was being held. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Bethany's face, frightened, alone, calling for him to save her. The weight of paternal responsibility pressed down on him like a physical thing, making even breathing feel like an effort. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his brooding. A single rider emerged from the morning mist, moving at a pace that suggested urgency without panic. As the figure drew closer, Owen recognized young Timothy Morrison from the general store, Herman's grandson, who sometimes carried messages between the scattered homesteads around Bitter Creek. "Mr. Blackthorne," the boy called out as he reined up at the front gate. "Got something for you." Man said it was important. Timothy handed Owen a small cloth bundle tied with twine. Inside was a delicate chain that Owen recognized immediately. It had belonged to Catherine, a compass rose pendant she'd worn every day of their marriage. Bethany had inherited it after her mother's death and treasured it as her most precious possession. Along with the pendant was another note, this one written in the same crude hand as the ransom demand. "Your girl wanted you to know she's alive. For now, but she won't be if you bring the law or try any tricks. 2 days left, she's a brave little thing. Reminds me of someone I used to know." The last line hit Owen like a punch to the gut. Cain was talking about Catherine, had to be. But how could he possibly know anything about Owen's late wife? The answer came to him with sickening clarity. Kane hadn't just been planning this kidnapping for weeks. He'd been researching Owen's life, learning about the people he'd loved, the losses he'd endured. Who gave this to you, Timothy? Owen asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the rage building inside him. Man at the crossroads about 5 miles south. Said his name was Porter, claimed he was a traveling merchant. Gave me 2 bits to deliver it quick-like. Owen knew there was no traveling merchant named Porter. Just as he knew the man had chosen that location specifically because it would be impossible to track him back to Kane's hideout. But the fact that Kane was using messengers meant he was confident enough in his position to send men out in the open, or desperate enough to take risks. Thank you, Timothy. Here's $1 for your trouble. The boy's eyes widened at the generous payment. Much obliged, Mr. Blackthorne. Hope everything works out all right. After Timothy left, Owen sat holding his wife's pendant, remembering the day he'd given it to her. They'd been married less than a month, and he'd been trying to find a way to tell her about his past, about the man he'd been before love had given him a reason to change. Catherine had listened without judgment, then placed her hand over the pendant and told him that a man's future mattered more than his history. Now that pendant was being used as proof that his daughter was alive, dangled before him like bait to ensure his cooperation. Kane was playing a deeper game than simple revenge. He was orchestrating a psychological torment designed to strip away Owen's resolve layer by layer. The sound of wheels on gravel announced another visitor. This time, it was Doc Patterson's medical wagon, with the elderly physician himself handling the reins. Doc had been ministering to the people of Bitter Creek for over 20 years, and his lined face had seen every kind of human suffering the frontier could produce. Owen, Doc said as he climbed down from the wagon. Heard about Bethany. Come to see if there's anything I can do to help. Appreciate the thought, Doc, but I don't think there's much anyone can do right now. Maybe not directly. But I've been thinking about what you might need, and I remembered something that could prove useful. Doc reached into his medical bag and pulled out a small brown bottle. Laudanum. Concentrated form, enough to put a grown man to sleep for 6 hours or more. Owen took the bottle, understanding immediately what Doc was suggesting. That's assuming I can get close enough to use it. Man, with your particular skills might find a way. Doc's eyes held a knowing look that suggested he understood. More about Owen's past than he'd ever let on. Sometimes the best way to handle a snake is to make it sleepy first. How did you know about your past? Doc chuckled softly. Son, I've been patching up gunshot wounds and knife cuts for more years than I care to count. I recognize the scars that come from that kind of life, and I know the look in a man's eyes when he's seen more death than any human being should. Question is, are you still capable of using those skills when they're needed? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Well, while you're figuring, keep this handy. Might save you from having to make choices you'd rather not make. After Doc left, Owen found himself walking toward town, drawn by the need to be around other people, even if he couldn't share the full weight of his burden with them. Main Street was beginning to show signs of the day's activity, shopkeepers opening their doors, children heading to school, the normal rhythm of a community going about its business. At the Silver Dollar Saloon, he found Maria Santos arranging chairs around the poker tables, preparing for another day of serving drinks to cowboys and merchants. She looked up as he entered, her dark eyes taking in his haggard appearance with immediate concern. You look like hell. Owen, feel worse than I look. Maria poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot she kept warming on the stove, sliding one across the bar to him. Heard about Bethany. I'm sorry, news travels fast in a small town, faster when it's bad news. Maria sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Question is, what are you planning to do about it? Owen studied her face, wondering how much she knew about his situation and how much he could safely tell her. Maria Santos had always been a woman who kept her own counsel, but she also had a network of contacts that stretched throughout the territory. Information flowed through the Silver Dollar like water through a creek, and not all of it was the kind that decent people wanted to hear. I'm planning to get my daughter back. That's not what I asked." Maria's voice was gentle but insistent. "I asked what you're planning to do." "There's a difference. Maybe there is. Maybe there isn't." Maria set down her coffee cup and leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I know things, Owen. Things about the men who took Bethany. Things about what they're capable of. These aren't desperate criminals looking for easy money. They're professional killers who enjoy their work." "How do you know that?" "Because 3 of them were in here 2 weeks ago, asking questions about you. They didn't give names, but they matched descriptions I've heard from other towns, other robberies. One of them, tall man with a scar across his cheek. He had the coldest eyes I've ever seen. Like looking into a frozen lake." Owen felt a chill run down his spine. Maria was describing Viper Kane himself, which meant the outlaw had been bold enough to walk into Bitter Creek in broad daylight, confident that no one would recognize him or be able to do anything about it, even if they did. What kind of questions were they asking? Your daily routine. When you left for work, when you came back. Whether you had family, friends, anyone who might miss you if you disappeared. Maria's expression was grave. "Owen, they weren't planning a kidnapping. They were planning a murder. Taking Bethany was just a way to make sure you'd come to them willingly." The revelation hit Owen like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears about Kane's true intentions. This wasn't about money or even simple revenge. It was about luring Owen into a trap where Kane could kill him slowly, personally, making him pay for whatever grievances had festered over the years. "There's something else," Maria continued. "Word came down from Denver yesterday. Federal marshals are organizing a manhunt for Kane's gang. Big operation, coordinated with local law enforcement. They're planning to sweep through this whole region, checking every hideout, every abandoned camp. When? End of the week, maybe sooner if they can get organized faster." Owen absorbed this information with mixed feelings. On one hand, federal involvement might mean more resources and expertise in tracking down Kane's gang. On the other hand, it also meant time was running out faster than he'd hoped. If Kane suspected a large-scale manhunt was coming, he might decide to eliminate his hostages and run rather than risk capture. "Maria, I need a favor. Name it. If anyone comes asking about this conversation, we talked about the weather and the price of whiskey. Nothing else." "What conversation?" Maria's slight smile was the first genuinely warm thing Owen had seen in 2 days. "You want some free advice from a woman who's seen her share of dangerous men?" "I'm listening." "Sometimes the only way to beat a monster is to become one yourself, even if it's just for a little while. The trick is making sure you can find your way back to being human when it's over." Owen left the saloon with Maria's words echoing in his mind, along with the growing certainty that his careful plans for a peaceful resolution were nothing more than wishful thinking. Kane had made this personal in ways that went far beyond simple criminal enterprise. The man wanted blood, wanted suffering, wanted to watch Owen Blackthorne pay for crimes that had haunted them both across years and miles. Walking back toward his empty house, Owen passed the schoolhouse where Bethany should have been sitting at her desk, learning about arithmetic and geography and all the peaceful subjects that mattered in a world where violence was held at bay by law and civilization. Instead, she was somewhere in the mountains, held captive by men who saw children as tools to be used and discarded. The torn ribbon in his pocket seemed to weigh more with each step he took. 2 days left, and he was no closer to a solution that didn't involve becoming the man he'd sworn never to be again. But as Maria had pointed out, sometimes the only way to defeat a monster was to become one, at least long enough to save the innocent. The empty swing creaked in the afternoon breeze as Owen reached his front porch, a sound that now seemed less like comfort and more like a countdown timer, marking the hours until his daughter's fate would be decided one way or another. The wanted poster appeared overnight, nailed to the post outside Morrison's general store like a declaration of war. Owen discovered it during his pre-dawn walk through town, the yellowed paper fluttering in the morning breeze like a battle flag from a conflict he'd hoped was long buried. The illustration was crude but recognizable, a tall man with hard eyes and a gun belt slung low on his hips. Above the drawing, in bold black letters, were the words that made Owen's blood run cold. Wanted, dead or alive. The Phantom, 2,000 reward for. The murder of Judge William Hazand. Other crimes against the territory. At the bottom of the poster, in smaller print, was a description that matched Owen's physical appearance perfectly, down to his unusual height and the scar on his left hand. From a childhood accident, someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure that anyone who saw this poster would immediately think of the quiet horse trainer who lived on the outskirts of Bitter Creek. Owen tore the poster down, crumpling it in his massive fist, but he knew the damage was already done. By sunrise, half the town would have seen it, and by noon the other half would have heard about it. There was no hiding from his past now, no pretending to be just another peaceful citizen trying to make an honest living. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 12 years building a reputation as a gentle giant who wouldn't hurt a fly, and now someone, Cain, obviously, had destroyed that carefully constructed identity with a single piece of paper. But there was something even more disturbing about the poster than its mere existence. The reward it offered was for crimes Owen had never committed, including the murder of Judge William Hayes, a man Owen had never even heard of. Cain wasn't just revealing Owen's past, he was rewriting it, creating a fictional history that would make every lawman in the territory see Owen as a dangerous fugitive, rather than a desperate father trying to save his daughter. It was a masterful piece of psychological warfare, designed to isolate Owen from any potential allies and force him to rely solely on his own resources. The sound of approaching footsteps made Owen turn. Sheriff Murdoch was walking toward him, his face grim and his hand resting on the butt of his sidearm. Behind him walked Deputy Pete, a young man who'd never looked more nervous in his short law enforcement career. "Owen," Murdoch said carefully, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "I think we need to talk." "I imagine we do. There are some serious allegations on that poster. Crimes that carry a federal death sentence. I never killed Judge Hayes, Roy. Never even met the man. But you were the Phantom." It wasn't a question, and Owen saw no point in denying what half the town had probably already guessed. "I was. Long time ago, before I came to Bitter Creek." "How long ago?" 12 years. I hung up my guns when Catherine died, made a promise to raise Bethany in peace. Sheriff Murdoch studied Owen's face, looking for signs of deception or dangerous intent. After a long moment, he slowly moved his hand away from his weapon. "I've known you for over a decade, Owen. Watched you raise that little girl. Seen how you treat your neighbors, your animals, everyone in this community. Whatever you might have been in the past, you're not a cold-blooded killer." Deputy Pete looked less convinced. "Sheriff, if he's wanted for murder, then we'll deal with it properly, through proper channels." Murdoch's tone brooked no argument. "But right now, Owen's daughter is missing, and that takes precedence over everything else." The sheriff's support meant more to Owen than he could adequately express, but he also recognized the impossible position it put the lawman in. By choosing not to arrest Owen immediately, Murdoch was risking his own career and reputation. "Roy, I appreciate what you're doing, but what I'm doing is my job," Murdoch cut him off. "My job is to protect the people of this community, and that includes you and Bethany. If someone's trying to frame you for crimes you didn't commit, then we'll figure out who and why. But first, we get your daughter back safe." More footsteps. On the wooden sidewalk announced the arrival of other townspeople, drawn by the unusual sight of the sheriff and his deputy in deep conversation with Owen Blackthorne. Herman Morrison emerged from his store, followed by Doc Patterson, Mrs. Kemp, and several other early risers who'd come to investigate the commotion. "What's all the fuss about?" Morrison asked, then noticed the crumpled poster in Owen's hand. "That wouldn't happen to be related to that wanted notice someone nailed to my post, would it?" The silence that followed was pregnant with tension and unasked questions. Owen could feel the weight of their stares. could practically hear the mental calculations as his neighbors tried to reconcile the man they knew with the dangerous fugitive described on the poster. It was Doc Patterson who broke the silence. "I don't care if Owen used to be Billy the Kid himself," the elderly physician said firmly. "Right now, he's a father whose child has been taken by murderers, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me, Mrs. Kemp, a woman who'd never been known for her charitable opinions." Surprised everyone by nodding in agreement. Doc's right. Whatever Owen might have done in the past, he's been nothing but a good neighbor and a loving father since he came to Bitter Creek. One by one, the other townspeople murmured their agreement. It was a remarkable display of community solidarity, the kind of support Owen had never expected to receive if his past was ever revealed. But even as he felt grateful for their loyalty, he also recognized that their support might put them in danger if Kane decided to expand his campaign of terror. "I appreciate what you're all doing," Owen said quietly. "More than you can know. But you need to understand that the man who took Bethany is playing a dangerous game, and anyone who gets too close might become a target." "Let him try," Morrison said with more bravery than common sense. "We take care of our own in Bitter Creek." As the crowd began to disperse, Tobias Fletcher approached from the direction of the livery stable. His expression was troubled, and Owen could tell immediately that his old friend had news. "None of it good. We need to talk," Tobias said quietly. Privately, they walked to the edge of town, where the wooden sidewalk gave way to dirt paths that led toward the surrounding homesteads. When they were far enough from curious ears, Tobias pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "Another one of these showed up at my place this morning," he said, handing Owen a copy of the wanted poster. "But this one had something extra written on the back." Owen turned the paper over and read the message scrawled in Kane's distinctive handwriting. "Tell your friend he's got 24 hours now instead of 2 days. Every poster I put up costs him time. Soon everyone in the territory will know who he really is, and then we'll see how many friends he has left." The psychological warfare was escalating. Kane was using Owen's revealed identity as a weapon, forcing him to choose between maintaining his relationships in Bitter Creek and saving his daughter's life. It was a cruel calculation, designed to maximize Owen's suffering while minimizing his options. "There's more," Tobias continued. "I talked to some of the ranchers west of here. 3 more posters showed up overnight, one at the Rocking M, one at the Double Bar, and one at the Wilson Place. Kane's spreading them all over the territory. How many men would that take? At least 6 or 7, working all night. Which means Kane's got more resources than we thought. And he's willing to expose his people to make sure you suffer." Owen stared at the wanted poster, seeing not just his own face but the faces of everyone in Bitter Creek who'd chosen to support him despite the revelations about his past. Sheriff Murdoch's career was now at risk. Doc Patterson and the others had made themselves potential targets. Even Bethany was being used as a pawn in a game that seemed designed to destroy everything Owen had built during his years of peaceful living. "Tobias, I need you to do something for me. Name it. If this goes bad, if something happens to me, I need you to make sure the town knows the truth about Judge Hayes. I never killed him, never even met him. Kane's manufacturing evidence to turn the law against me. Nothing's going to happen to you. Maybe not. But if it does, I don't want people remembering me as a child killer or a murderer of judges. Whatever else I might have been, I never crossed those lines." Tobias nodded grimly. "You have my word. But Owen, you need to start thinking about this differently. Kane's not just trying to hurt you personally. He's trying to destroy your ability to function in civilized society. Pretty soon, every lawman in 3 territories is going to be looking for the Phantom, and you won't be able to ask for help from anyone. Then I guess I better handle this quickly." "How?" Owen looked toward the mountains where his daughter was being held, calculating distances and travel times and the 100 different ways this situation could go wrong. "I'm not sure yet, but I'm starting to think that trying to solve this peacefully was naive from the beginning, meaning Meaning, maybe it's time to give Kane what he's been asking for all these years, a face-to-face meeting with the Phantom. The words tasted bitter in Owen's mouth. But he was beginning to understand that some battles couldn't be won with good intentions and moral principles. Kane had made this war personal by taking Bethany, and he'd made it public by revealing Owen's past to the world. The time for peaceful solutions was rapidly running out. As they walked back toward town, Owen found himself thinking about the gun belt hidden beneath his floorboards, wondering if 12 years of peaceful living had dulled the skills that had once made him the most feared man in the territory. There was only one way to find out, and that knowledge might soon mean the difference between life and death, not just for him, but for his daughter. The empty swing on his front porch seemed to mock him as they passed his house, a reminder of the innocence that had been stolen and the choices that lay ahead. In less than 24 hours, he would have to decide whether to remain Owen Blackthorne, the gentle horse trainer, or become the Phantom once more, even if it meant losing his soul in the process. The sound came in the deep hours of the night, so soft Owen might have missed it if desperation hadn't sharpened his senses to razor-fine alertness. 3 short notes, a pause, then 3 more, the simple melody of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star played on a harmonica in the distance, and carried on the mountain wind like a whispered prayer. Owen sat bolt upright in the chair where he'd been dozing fitfully, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew that melody, knew it better than his own name. It was the song he'd hummed to Bethany when she was a baby, the same tune she'd requested every night during her bout with scarlet fever 3 years ago, the music that had become their private language of comfort and love. The harmonica had been his gift to her on her 10th birthday, a small silver instrument that she'd learned to play with the same patience and determination she brought to everything else in her young life. The fact that she was playing it now, in the darkness of whatever prison Kane had fashioned for her, meant she was not only alive but thinking, planning, trying to communicate across the miles that separated them. Owen crept to his window, straining to hear the melody again. There it was, 3 notes, pause, 3 more, but this time followed by a different pattern. Not Twinkle, Twinkle this time, but Home on the Range, the song she'd been learning just before her abduction. Then another pause, and the opening bars of Amazing Grace. The pattern suddenly became clear to Owen with stunning clarity. Bethany wasn't just playing random songs to comfort herself, she was sending him a message, using a code they'd developed during long evenings on the front porch when she was learning to play. Each song represented a different letter of the alphabet, based on the order in which she'd mastered them. Twinkle, Twinkle was A, Home on the Range was B, Amazing Grace was C. With growing excitement, Owen grabbed paper and pencil, translating each melody as it drifted through the night air. ABC, then a longer pause, followed by more songs. It took nearly an hour of careful listening, but eventually Bethany's message became clear. ABCEFG, 8 men, Canyon East, water problem, Papa Strongite men, not the 6 or 7 that reports had suggested. The canyon to the east, which meant Devil's Canyon, but approaching from the opposite direction than expected. A water problem. Perhaps their source was running dry, or they were having to ration supplies. And finally, the message that broke Owen's heart and filled him with pride in equal measure. Papa strong. Even in captivity, even frightened and alone, his 12-year-old daughter was trying to encourage him. But there was more to the message than just information. The fact that Bethany was able to play her harmonica at all meant she wasn't bound or constantly guarded. The guards Kane had mentioned must be posted outside her prison, close enough to prevent escape, but far enough away not to hear soft music in the night. It was a crucial piece of intelligence that might prove useful in planning her rescue. Owen spent the remainder of the night studying maps of Devil's Canyon, trying to work out how 8 men might be positioned to defend their hideout while dealing with some kind of water shortage. The abandoned mining operation that Tobias had mentioned would have required a reliable water source for its operations. But mountain streams could dry up or be diverted by rock slides or seasonal changes. As dawn approached, Owen made his decision. He couldn't wait any longer for a perfect plan or ideal circumstances. Bethany had given him intelligence that might not remain valid for more than a few hours. And Kane's psychological warfare was escalating to the point where soon every lawman in the territory would be hunting the phantom instead of focusing on the real criminals. The hidden compartment beneath his floorboards opened with the same soft whisper it had maintained for over a decade. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the tools of a trade Owen had hoped never to practice again. The gun belt was exactly as he'd left it, supple leather kept in perfect condition by careful maintenance, brass buckles that caught the lamplight like gold, and holsters molded to fit his weapons with the precision of a craftsman's finest work. The Colt .45. Peacemaker felt strange in his hand after so many years, heavier than he remembered but somehow familiar, like greeting an old friend after a long separation. The ivory grip was worn smooth by countless hours of practice and use, marked with tiny scratches that told the story of a violent life he'd tried so hard to leave behind. But it wasn't just the physical weight of the weapon that made. Owen's hands trembled slightly as he checked the action and verified the ammunition. It was the psychological weight of what wearing these guns again would mean, not just to his enemies, but to himself, and to the memory of the promises he'd made. A soft knock at his door interrupted his brooding. Owen quickly rewrapped the gun belt and replaced it in its hiding place before answering. Sheriff Murdoch stood on the front porch, his face haggard with exhaustion and worry. "Roy, it's barely sunrise, I know. I've been up all night thinking about this situation, and I've come to a decision." Murdoch stepped inside without being invited, his eyes taking in Owen's disheveled appearance and the papers scattered across the kitchen table. "I'm riding with you to Devil's Canyon." "Like hell you are." "Owen, listen to me. You're a good man, but you're not a lawman, and you're not thinking clearly. You're planning to ride into that canyon alone, probably armed, probably intending to take on 8 killers by yourself. That's not rescue. That's suicide. It's also not your problem. The hell it isn't. Bethany is a citizen of this community, and protecting citizens is exactly my problem." Murdoch moved to the window, looking out at the mountains, where the morning light was just beginning to touch the highest peaks. "Besides, if you get yourself killed, who's going to clear your name of those murder charges Kane's trying to pin on you?" Owen felt a surge of gratitude for the sheriff's loyalty, even as he recognized the impossibility of accepting such help. "Roy, if you ride with me, you're not just risking your life, you're risking your career, your reputation, everything you've built here. Some things are more important than career and reputation." "Like what?" "Like doing what's right, like protecting a child, like standing with a friend when he needs it most." The simple sincerity in Murdoch's voice almost broke Owen's resolve to handle this situation alone. But the memory of Bethany's harmonica message was still fresh in his mind, along with the growing certainty that rescuing his daughter would require skills and methods that no honest lawman should have to employ. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, Roy, more than you can know. But this isn't a job for honest men with badges and principles." "What's that supposed to mean?" Owen turned away from the sheriff's penetrating stare, unable to meet his eyes while voicing the truth he'd been trying to avoid. "It means that saving Bethany is going to require me to become someone I've spent 12 years trying not to be. Someone you shouldn't be associated with when it's over." "Owen, Kane doesn't want money, Roy. He wants blood. My blood, specifically in payment for something that happened more than a decade ago. The only way to beat him is to give him what he's asking for, a meeting with the Phantom. But the man who walks into that canyon might not be the same one who walks out." Murdoch was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications of what Owen was telling him. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful but determined. "Maybe not. But whoever walks out of that canyon is going to need friends who believe in redemption and second chances. I plan to be one of those friends." Before Owen could respond, another knock interrupted them. This time it was Tobias Fletcher, carrying a cloth bundle and wearing the grim expression of a man who'd made peace with dangerous necessities. Morning. Owen, Sheriff. Tobias nodded to Murdoch, then turned his attention to Owen. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I've come to some conclusions, such as the fact that you're not going into those mountains alone, no matter what kind of noble sacrifice you think you're making. Owen felt a familiar frustration rising in his chest. These were good men, honorable men, and their willingness to risk themselves for his daughter was both humbling and terrifying. But good intentions wouldn't stop bullets, and honor was a luxury he couldn't afford when Bethany's life hung in the balance. Tobias, I appreciate— Shut up and listen for once, Tobias interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of steel that reminded Owen why they'd been such effective partners in the old days. You think you're the only one who remembers how to fight? You think 12 years of peaceful living has made the rest of us forget everything we used to know? Tobias unwrapped his bundle, revealing not just the gun belt he'd offered earlier, but also a detailed map of Devil's Canyon, marked with notations in red ink. I spent yesterday afternoon scouting the approaches to that canyon, talking to people who know the country, figuring out the best ways in and out. You what? I did what needed doing. Same as you would have done for me if the situation was reversed. Tobias spread the map on Owen's kitchen table, pointing to various marked locations. The mining camp Bethany's being held in is here, about 3 miles up from the main canyon entrance. There are 2 ways to approach it: the obvious route up the canyon floor, and a harder path along the eastern rim that would put you above the camp. Sheriff Murdoch leaned over the map, studying Tobias's notations with professional interest. How do you know all this? Because I used to ride with Owen back in the day. Same skills, same training, just applied to different problems. Tobias met Owen's eyes with steady determination. I made the same promise to walk away from violence, and I've kept it just as faithfully as you have. But sometimes promises have to be balanced against necessities. Owen stared at the map, seeing not just tactical information but also the evidence of his friend's commitment to helping save Bethany. The notations were thorough and professional, the kind of detailed intelligence that could make the difference between a successful rescue and a disaster. Tobias, if we do this, if I let you help, there's no guarantee we'll be able to walk away clean when it's over. Kane's not going to surrender, and his men aren't going to run. This is going to end in blood, I know, and you're willing to accept that, to save your daughter, to help my oldest friend. Yes, I'm willing to accept that. Sheriff Murdoch cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to his presence. If you two are planning some kind of military operation, you're going to need someone with legal authority to make sure it doesn't turn into a massacre. Roy, I'm going with you. Owen, not as a favor, not as a friend, but as a sworn officer of the law who has jurisdiction over crimes committed in this territory. Like it or not, you need me there to ensure that whatever happens can be justified legally. Owen looked from the sheriff to his old friend, seeing determination in both their faces that matched his own. They were right, he realized. This wasn't just about his personal need for revenge or his parental obligation to save Bethany. It was about justice, about protecting the innocent, about standing up to men who preyed on the weak and defenseless. All right, he said finally. But if we do this, we do it my way. No questions, no second-guessing, no mercy for men who threaten children. Can you both live with that? Both men nodded without hesitation. Then we leave at noon. That gives us time to prepare and still reach the canyon by nightfall. Owen looked at the map one more time, memorizing the details that might keep them all alive. And gentlemen, whatever happens up there, we're all coming home, including Bethany. The empty swing on his front porch creaked in the morning breeze as the 3 men began planning their assault on Devil's Canyon. Its sound now less like a lament and more like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The ledger book looked innocuous enough, worn leather covers, yellowed pages filled with columns of numbers and dates. But as Owen studied its contents by lamplight in the abandoned miner's shack they'd chosen as their observation post, He realized he was looking at something that could change everything. They'd reached Devil's Canyon as planned, moving through the mountain passes with the careful precision of men who understood that one mistake could prove fatal. Tobias had led them along game trails and forgotten mining roads, keeping them well away from the main approaches where Kane's sentries might be watching. The 3-hour climb had been brutal, but it had brought them to a position overlooking the old mining camp where Bethany was being held. Through his field glasses, Owen could see the layout exactly as Tobias's map had indicated. The main cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by smaller outbuildings, with guards posted at 2 visible locations and probably more hidden in the surrounding trees. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, and lamplight glowed through the windows, signs of life that made Owen's heart race with the hope that his daughter was safe inside. But it was Sheriff Murdoch who'd made the discovery that changed their entire understanding of the situation. While scouting the perimeter of the camp, he'd stumbled across a hidden cache of supplies tucked away in what had once been the mining operations tool shed. Among the stolen goods and weapons was the ledger book, apparently dropped or forgotten during the gang's hasty setup of their hideout. "Look at these entries," Murdoch whispered, pointing to a series of transactions recorded in Kane's distinctive handwriting. Every job they've pulled in the last 2 years, every dollar they've stolen, every cut each man was supposed to receive. Owen studied the figures, noting the meticulous record-keeping that suggested Kane ran his gang more like a business than a typical outlaw operation. But it was the discrepancies that caught his attention. Entries where the totals stolen didn't match the amounts distributed to the gang members. He's been skimming, Owen realized, taking 20, sometimes 30% off the top and keeping it for himself. More than that, Tobias added, pointing to another section of the ledger. "Look at these names. Half the men listed here aren't even with the gang anymore. But Kane's been recording their shares as distributed, then keeping the money. The implications were staggering. If Kane's own men discovered they'd been systematically cheated, the gang would tear itself apart from within." It was exactly the kind of leverage Owen had been hoping to find. A way to defeat his enemies without having to become the monster he'd sworn never to be again. "There's more," Murdoch continued, flipping to a page near the back of the book. "Look at this entry from 6 months ago. Special commission from J.H., 5,000 for elimination of OB in Colorado Territory. Owen, someone paid Kane $5,000 to kill you specifically." The revelation hit Owen like a physical blow. This wasn't just about old grudges or personal vendetta. It was a professional assassination contract with his daughter's kidnapping as the preferred method of execution. But who had enough money to pay such a sum? And why did they want Owen Blackthorne dead badly enough to hire the most vicious killer in the territory? "J.H., Owen murmured, trying to match the initials to faces from his past. "Could be anyone. Not anyone with that kind of money," Tobias pointed out. $5,000 means we're talking about someone with serious wealth and serious motivation. Before Owen could respond, a commotion erupted in the mining camp below. Angry voices carried across the night air, followed by the sound of something crashing inside the main cabin. Through his field glasses, Owen watched as Kane's men gathered in the clearing, their body language suggesting the kind of heated argument that might escalate to violence. "What's happening down there?" Murdoch whispered. Owen adjusted his focus, trying to make out individual figures in the lamplight spilling from the cabin doorway. "Looks like they're having a disagreement about something. 2 men are shouting at each other, the others are choosing sides." As they watched, the argument grew more intense. One of Kane's men, a tall figure Owen didn't recognize, grabbed another man by the shirt and shoved him backward. The shoved man stumbled, then reached for his gun, prompting several other gang members to draw their own weapons. "This could be our chance," Tobias suggested. "If they start shooting each other, we might be able to get in and out with Bethany before they know what hit them." But Owen was thinking beyond the immediate opportunity. If Kane's gang was falling apart due to internal disputes, It might be possible to accelerate that process using the information in the ledger. Instead of fighting 8 desperate men with nothing to lose, he could turn them against each other and face only Kane himself in the end. We're going to try something different, Owen decided. Tobias, you still remember how to move through enemy territory without being seen? Like riding a bicycle. Good. I need you to get close enough to that camp to leave this ledger where Kane's men will find it, but where it'll look like Kane dropped it himself. You want to show them how he's been cheating them. I want to give them a reason to question their loyalty to a man who's been stealing from them for years. Once that trust breaks down, they'll be more interested in fighting each other than protecting their hostage. It was a risky plan, requiring Tobias to get within a few yards of armed killers who would shoot him on sight if discovered. But it was also the kind of psychological warfare that had made Owen legendary in his previous life, using an enemy's weaknesses against them instead of relying on superior firepower. What about the girl? Murdoch asked. If the gang starts shooting each other, she could get caught in the crossfire. That's where we come in. Once the chaos starts, we move in fast and hard. Get Bethany out of there before anyone realizes what's happening. The plan was far from perfect, but it offered something Owen's other strategies had lacked: the possibility of success without requiring him to become a killer again. If Kane's men turned on each other, if the gang fell apart from within, then maybe Bethany could be rescued without adding more blood to Owen's already stained conscience. As Tobias prepared for his infiltration mission, stripping away anything that might reflect light or make noise, Owen found himself thinking about the mysterious J.H. who had paid for his assassination. The timing suggested someone who'd known about Owen's peaceful life in Bitter Creek, someone who'd wanted him eliminated badly enough to hire professional killers. Roy, Owen whispered, when we get back to town, I need you to help me research something. Those initials, J.H., and anyone with enough money to pay for a professional killing. You have someone in mind? Maybe, but it's been so long, I'm not sure if my memory's reliable. The sound of Tobias moving through the underbrush was barely audible, testament to skills that hadn't dulled despite years of peaceful living. Owen watched through his field glasses as his old friend became a shadow among shadows, moving with the kind of fluid grace that had made them both legendary in their younger days. Below in the mining camp, the argument seemed to have settled into an uneasy truce, with Kane's men spreading out to resume their guard duties. But Owen could see the tension in their movements, the way they kept glancing at each other with suspicious eyes. The seeds of mistrust were already there. Tobias's mission would simply help them grow into something destructive. 20 minutes passed before Tobias returned, moving through the darkness with the same silent efficiency he'd displayed going in. Done, he whispered. Left the book under some papers near their supply cache. Made it look like it fell out of Kane's saddlebags when he was checking their provisions. How long before they find it? One of them was already heading toward the supply shed when I left. I'd say we've got maybe an hour before all hell breaks loose down there. Owen nodded, checking his weapons one final time and ensuring that his approach route to the main cabin was clear in his mind. Everything depended on timing now. Moving too early would alert Kane to their presence, but waiting too long might result in Bethany being hurt if the gang's internal conflict turned violent. As they settled in to wait for the psychological warfare to take effect, Owen found himself thinking about the choices that had led him to this moment. 12 years ago, he'd walked away from violence, convinced that there had to be a better way to solve problems than with guns and bloodshed. Tonight, he was using those same violent skills in service of a different kind of justice, not the brutal, personal revenge Kane expected, but the careful, surgical application of force designed to minimize casualties while achieving his objective. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to avoid becoming the Phantom again, he'd been forced to use every skill that identity had given him. But maybe that was the real lesson. Not that violence was always wrong, but that it had to be used wisely, discriminately, in service of something greater than personal satisfaction. The first shouts from the mining camp came exactly 57 minutes after Tobias's return, carrying clearly across the night air with the unmistakable sound of men who just discovered they'd been betrayed by someone they trusted. Owen smiled grimly as he watched Kane's gang begin to tear itself apart from within. Exactly as he'd hoped, it was time to get his daughter back. Owen's hands were steady as he removed his wedding ring. The simple gold band Catherine had placed on his finger 15 years ago in a small church ceremony attended by more horses than people. The metal was worn smooth by years of wear, marked with tiny scratches that told the story of a life lived in service to others, breaking horses, raising a child, building something peaceful in a world that seemed determined to remain violent. He placed the ring carefully in his vest pocket, next to the torn piece of blue silk ribbon that had started this nightmare. If he didn't survive what was coming, someone would find these tokens and understand what had mattered most to Owen Blackthorne in his final moments. Below, in Devil's Canyon, Kane's gang was falling apart with the spectacular violence Owen had hoped for. The discovery of the ledger had shattered whatever trust had held the group together, and now former allies were settling old grievances with bullets and knives. 3 men were already down, their bodies sprawled in the clearing like discarded puppets, while the survivors had taken cover behind various buildings and were shooting at shadows. "It's working better than we could have hoped," Tobias whispered, adjusting his position to get a better view of the chaos. "I count 5 men still active, but they're so busy fighting each other, they've completely forgotten about perimeter security." Sheriff Murdoch nodded toward the main cabin, where lamplight still glowed behind shuttered windows. "Question is, where's Kane in all this? And more importantly, where's Bethany?" Owen had been wondering the same thing. The gang leader was notably absent from the firefight consuming his men, which meant he was either dead, fled, or holed up somewhere with the most valuable asset in the camp, Owen's daughter. None of those possibilities offered much comfort. "We're going in," Owen decided, checking his weapons one final time. The Colt 45 felt natural in his hand now, muscle memory overriding more than a decade of peaceful living. "Tobias, you take the left approach. Try to get behind the supply shed. Roy, you come in from the right, but stay back unless things go completely wrong. What about you?" "I'm going straight for the main cabin. If Kane's got Bethany, that's where they'll be." It was a simple plan, direct and brutal in its efficiency. But as Owen prepared to move down the hillside toward the mining camp, he found himself thinking about the letter he'd written earlier that evening, addressed to his daughter and hidden beneath the loose floorboard in his bedroom back in Bitter Creek. The letter contained everything he'd never found the courage to tell her about his past. The violence, the guilt, the long chain of events that had led to Catherine's death and their subsequent exile to the frontier. More importantly, it contained his apologies for the choices he'd made, and the man he'd been before love had given him a reason to change. "My dearest Bethany," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I did not survive the attempt to bring you home safely. Please know that everything I did, every choice I made in those final hours, was motivated by love for you and the desperate hope that you might have the chance to live the life your mother and I dreamed of for you." He'd written about Catherine, too, about the woman who'd seen something worth saving in a killer and had devoted her life to helping him become someone better. Bethany deserved to know about her mother's courage, her patience, her unshakable faith in the possibility of redemption, but there had been practical matters to address as well. The letter included instructions for accessing the money Owen had saved over the years, enough to ensure Bethany would never want for anything material. It contained the names of people who could be trusted to help her: Doc Patterson, Sheriff Murdoch, Tobias Fletcher, even Maria Santos from the Silver Dollar Saloon. Most importantly, it contained Owen's final wishes for his daughter's future. He wanted her to remember him as the man he'd become, not the one he'd been. He wanted her to understand that violence might sometimes be necessary, but it should never be the first choice or the preferred solution. He wanted her to know that the greatest strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the courage to help them. The sound of renewed gunfire from the mining camp brought Owen's attention back to the present moment. Whatever regrets he had about the past, whatever fears he harbored about the future, they would have to wait. Right now, his daughter needed him to be the man he'd trained himself to become, strong enough to protect the innocent, skilled enough to face killers on their own terms, but wise enough to choose mercy when vengeance would be easier. "Ready?" he asked his companions. Both men nodded, their faces set with the grim determination of people who understood they might not see another sunrise. They'd all written their own letters that evening, made their own peace with the choices that had brought them to this moment. Owen began his descent toward the mining camp, moving with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent years learning to be invisible in dangerous places. Each step was calculated, each movement designed to avoid loose rocks or dry branches that might alert his enemies to his presence. Behind him, he could hear Tobias and Murdoch taking their own paths down the hillside, spreading out to create multiple angles of approach. As he drew closer to the camp, Owen could make out individual voices among the shouts and gunfire, men calling out positions, demanding to know who could be trusted, accusing each other of betrayal and cowardice. The psychological warfare had worked even better than he'd hoped. Kane's gang wasn't just fighting over money. They were destroying each other with the kind of paranoid fury that comes when thieves realize they've been living among other thieves. The main cabin sat about 50 yards from Owen's position, its windows glowing with the warm light of oil lamps. No guards were visible outside. They'd either joined the general firefight or had been reassigned to protect Kane himself. Either way, it meant Owen might be able to reach Bethany without having to fight his way through a gauntlet of armed killers. But as he prepared to cross the open ground between the forest and the cabin, a new sound cut through the chaos, the clear, unmistakable notes of a harmonica playing Amazing Grace. Bethany was alive, alert, and still trying to communicate with him across the distance that separated them. The melody carried a message too, using the same code they'd developed during those peaceful evenings on the front porch. Owen decoded it quickly. "Papa, danger, trap, uncle, help, uncle!" Owen felt his blood run cold as the implications hit him. Kane wasn't just some random killer from his violent past. He was family, somehow connected to Catherine in ways Owen had never suspected. But that would mean the realization struck him like lightning. Kane's vendetta wasn't about professional rivalry or wounded pride. It was personal in the deepest possible way, rooted in family connections and old grievances that went back to the very foundation of Owen's peaceful life in Bitter Creek. JH. The initials from the ledger suddenly made sense. Connecting to a name Owen had heard Catherine mention only once. Years ago when she'd been delirious with fever and talking about family she'd left behind. James Hayes, her brother, the one who'd blamed Owen for taking his sister away from the life she'd been born to live, Judge William Hayes. The man Owen was supposed to have murdered, according to the wanted poster. Catherine's brother, who'd become a respected jurist and had never forgiven the gunslinger who'd stolen his sister's heart and led her to an early grave on the frontier. It all made sense now, the careful planning, the personal nature of the psychological warfare, the way Kane seemed to know exactly how to cause Owen maximum suffering. This wasn't just about revenge for some old cattle war in Texas. This was about family, about blame and guilt and the terrible price of love in a violent world. Owen forced himself to focus on the immediate situation, despite the emotional tsunami threatening to overwhelm him. Whatever Kane's true identity, whatever family connections existed between them, Bethany was still a prisoner and still in mortal danger. The revelations would have to wait until she was safe. Moving with renewed urgency, Owen covered the remaining distance to the main cabin in a series of quick sprints between available cover. The gunfight was beginning to wind down as Kane's men either killed each other or ran out of ammunition. But that meant the survivors would soon be looking around for new targets. At the cabin's rear wall, Owen paused to listen for sounds from inside. He could hear voices, a man's low growl and Bethany's higher tones responding with the kind of defiant courage that made Owen's heart swell with pride, even in the midst of his terror. His daughter was afraid but not broken, frightened but still fighting. Through a gap in the shutters, Owen could see into what had once been the mining operations main office. Kane sat at a rough wooden table, his back to the window, while Bethany stood near the opposite wall with her hands bound in front of her. The family resemblance was unmistakable now that Owen knew what to look for. The same auburn hair Catherine had possessed, the same stubborn set to the jaw, the same green eyes that could flash with anger or soften with compassion. Kane was talking, his voice too low for Owen to make out individual words, but Bethany's responses carried clearly through the thin walls. My papa's not a killer anymore. He's a good man who helps people. Your papa is a murderer who destroyed our family. You're wrong. Mama loved him and he loved her. That's not destruction. That's what families are supposed to be. The exchange told Owen everything he needed to know about the battle being waged inside the cabin. Kane was trying to poison Bethany against her father, to make her believe that Owen was responsible for all the pain and loss in their extended family's history. But Bethany, with the clarity of youth and the strength of love, was refusing to accept that narrative. Owen checked his weapons one final time, said a silent prayer to whatever God might be listening, and prepared to end a conflict that had been brewing for more than a decade. Win or lose, live or die, this was where it would be settled, not with armies or pauses, but between two men who'd loved the same woman and blamed each other for her death. The empty swing on his front porch seemed very far away as Owen reached for the cabin door, ready to face whatever waited on the other side. The cabin door swung open with a soft creak that seemed to echo like thunder in the sudden silence. Owen stepped across the threshold with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent years learning to move without sound, his massive frame filling the doorway as his eyes adjusted to the lamplight within. Viper Kane, James Hayes, sat at the far end of the room, his gun already drawn and pointed directly at Bethany's head. The family resemblance to Catherine was even more pronounced in person. The same aristocratic features and intelligent eyes, but twisted by years of bitterness into something cruel and predatory. "Hello, brother," Kane said with a smile that held no warmth. "I was wondering when you'd finally show up." Bethany's face lit up with joy and relief at the sight of her father, but she had the wisdom to remain still, understanding instinctively that any sudden movement might trigger violence. The ropes binding her wrists had been loosened. She could have freed herself if she'd chosen to, Owen realized. Kane had been giving her the illusion of freedom while keeping her trapped through the threat of harm to others. "Let her go, James. This is between you and me." Kane's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Oh, but you're wrong about that, Owen. This has always been about her, about Catherine's daughter, the child who should have been raised in civilization instead of this God-forsaken wilderness." Owen remained motionless just inside the doorway, his own weapon still holstered, but his hand resting near the grip. Every instinct screamed at him to draw and fire, to end this confrontation before Kane could hurt Bethany. But the outlaw's gun was already positioned, finger tight on the trigger, and Owen knew that any sudden movement would result in his daughter's death. "Catherine chose to come west," Owen said carefully. "No one forced her. Catherine was 19 years old and infatuated with a dangerous man who promised her adventure and excitement. She didn't know what she was choosing, didn't understand what kind of life she was condemning herself to." The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke, carrying the weight of old grief and older guilt. Owen had wrestled with similar thoughts during the dark hours after Catherine's death, wondering if she might have lived longer, happier, in the civilized comfort of her brother's world. "She was happy," Owen replied, though the words felt inadequate against the magnitude of Kane's rage. "We built something good together, something worth preserving. You built nothing but a grave in the wilderness. My sister died in childbirth, alone except for some frontier doctor who probably learned his trade on horses. She deserved better than that. Bethany spoke up then, her voice clear and strong despite her fear. Mama wasn't alone. She had Papa, and Doc Patterson has delivered more babies than any doctor in Denver. She told me before she died that she was grateful for the life they'd built together. Kane's hand tightened on his weapon, and for a moment Owen thought the man might actually shoot his own niece out of pure frustration. But the moment passed, and Kane's attention returned to Owen with laser focus. Did you really think you could hide forever in that little town? Did you think I'd never find you? I hoped you were dead. I should have been. You left me for dead in that cattle war, shot through the lung and bleeding out in a Texas arroyo. But I survived, Owen. I crawled out of that grave you dug for me, and I've spent the last 12 years planning this moment. The mining camp outside had grown quiet. The gunfight apparently ended with Kane's gang either dead or scattered. Through the gaps in the shutters, Owen could see movement in the shadows. Tobias and Sheriff Murdoch taking positions, waiting for their chance to act. But Owen knew this confrontation couldn't be resolved by outside intervention. Kane had orchestrated everything too carefully, had planned too long, and sacrificed too much to be denied his moment of personal revenge. This was between family members now, a settling of accounts that went back to Catherine's death and forward to Bethany's future. What do you want from me, James? I want you to suffer the way I've suffered. I want you to feel helpless and desperate and completely alone. Then I want you to die, knowing that your daughter will be raised by people who understand the value of civilization over barbarism. And if I refuse? Kane's smile was cold as mountain snow. Then Bethany dies right here, right now. And you get to live with that knowledge for the rest of your very short life. Owen felt something shift inside him, a familiar coldness that he'd hoped never to experience again. The careful restraints he'd built around his violent nature began to crack, not from anger or hatred, but from the crystalline clarity of purpose that came when protecting the innocent required extreme measures. There's another option, Owen said quietly. Such as? You and me, one-on-one. No guns, no tricks, no innocent people caught in the crossfire. If you win, Bethany goes with you, and I accept whatever judgment you think I deserve. If I win, this ends here and now. Kane considered the proposal, his eyes narrowing as he tried to identify the trap he was certain Owen was laying. But there was no deception. Owen was offering exactly what Kane had wanted from the beginning. A personal confrontation where the stronger man would determine the outcome. And why would I accept those terms when I already have everything I want? Because you're Catherine's brother, and despite everything you've done, some part of you still remembers what she taught us about honor and doing what's right. The appeal to family loyalty and shared memories hit Kane like a physical blow. Owen could see the internal struggle playing out across the man's face, the desire for revenge warring with the values Catherine had tried to instill in both of them. She used to say that violence should always be the last resort, Kane said slowly, that there had to be better ways to solve problems than with guns and bloodshed. She was right. But she also said that sometimes a man has no choice but to fight for what he believes in. Owen nodded, recognizing Catherine's words, even as he understood how Kane was twisting them to justify his actions. She said that too. The question is, what are you really fighting for, James? Justice or just revenge? Before Kane could answer, the sound of breaking glass announced that someone else had entered the conversation. Through the shattered window came not bullets or grenades, but something far more dangerous, the truth, in the form of the missing pages from Kane's ledger that Tobias had apparently held back as insurance. The papers scattered across the floor like leaves in an autumn wind, their neat columns of figures telling the story of Kane's betrayal of his own men. But it was the final page that caught Owen's attention, the one that contained not financial records but correspondence, letters between Kane and his secret employer, signed with the initials that had started this revelation, J.H., not James Hayes, but Judge Harold Hayes, Kane's father and Catherine's father, the man who'd never forgiven his daughter for choosing love over social position. The judge hadn't just hired Cain to kill Owen. He'd provided detailed intelligence about Owen's life in Bitter Creek, including Bethany's daily routine and the best opportunities for kidnapping her. "Your own father," Owen said, his voice filled with disgust as he read the correspondence. "He used you to do his dirty work, to get revenge on the man who stole his daughter." Cain's face went white as he realized what Owen was reading. The gun in his hand wavered, no longer pointed directly at Bethany, but not yet lowered completely. "That's impossible. My father died 3 years ago. Read the dates on these letters. James, the most recent one, is from 2 months ago." The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of Tobias and Sheriff Murdoch, who'd taken advantage of the distraction to position themselves at the cabin's other entrances. But neither man made any aggressive moves. They recognized that this had become something beyond law enforcement or military tactics. This was about family, about truth, about the terrible price of secrets and the even more terrible cost of revenge. And it could only be resolved by the people who'd been carrying those burdens for more than a decade. The letters scattered across the cabin floor told a story more devastating than any bullet could have delivered. Cain, James Hayes, knelt among the papers, his gun forgotten as he read correspondence from a father he'd believed dead. Instructions for a mission that had consumed the last 2 years of his life. "He said you killed her," Cain whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of revelations. "He said you were a murderer who'd destroyed our family, that Catherine would still be alive if she'd never met you." Owen remained motionless, understanding that this moment was more dangerous than any gunfight he'd ever survived. A man could accept being killed by an enemy, but learning that your entire crusade had been built on lies, that was the kind of betrayal that either broke a person completely or transformed them into something far worse. Bethany, with the wisdom that sometimes comes to children in moments of crisis, spoke into the terrible silence. "Uncle James, Papa loved Mama more than anything in the world. When she died, he cried for 3 days straight and wouldn't eat or drink anything. If he could have saved her, he would have died trying." Cain looked up at his niece, seeing Catherine's eyes in her face, hearing Catherine's voice in her words. "But she died giving birth to you. She died because she chose this life instead of staying in civilization where she belonged. She died because sometimes people die. Uncle James, not because anyone wanted them to. Not because anyone was evil or bad, but because that's what life does sometimes. It takes people away from us." The simple truth from a 12-year-old girl accomplished what all of Owen's arguments couldn't. Cain's rage began to crumble, replaced by the kind of grief that he'd been holding at bay for more than a decade. The gun slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor like a piece of discarded metal. "I've spent 12 years planning this," Cain said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. 12 years, learning to hate you, learning to blame you for everything that went wrong in our family. "And your father encouraged that hate," Owen said gently. "Used it to turn you into his personal instrument of revenge." Cain picked up one of the letters, reading his father's elegant handwriting with growing horror. He knew Catherine was happy. He knew she loved you, loved the life you'd built together. But he couldn't accept that she'd chosen happiness over social position. Sheriff Murdoch stepped forward carefully, his hand extended toward the discarded weapon. "James, I'm going to secure this gun, but I'm not arresting you unless you make me. What you do next is up to you." "What I do next," Cain repeated, as if the concept of choice was foreign to him. "For 12 years, every decision I've made has been about this moment. What do I do when the moment turns out to be built on lies?" Owen knelt down beside his brother-in-law, close enough to be killed easily, but far enough away not to seem threatening. "You choose who you want to be from this moment forward. Catherine always believed people could change, could become better than they were, even murderers like me. Especially people like you, people who've made terrible choices because they were in terrible pain." Bethany approached slowly, her freed hands extended toward her uncle in a gesture that spoke of forgiveness before any words were exchanged. "Uncle James, I'd like to know about my mother when she was young. Papa tells me stories, but he didn't know her when she was a little girl. The simple request broke something inside Cain that 12 years of hatred had been holding together. He began to weep, not the bitter tears of rage and loss, but the cleansing sorrow of a man finally allowing himself to grieve properly for someone he'd loved and lost. She was beautiful, Cain said through his tears. Smart and funny and kind to everyone, even the servants our father thought were beneath his notice. She used to sneak food from the kitchen to give to hungry children, and when father found out, she'd accept the punishment without complaint. That sounds like Mama, Bethany said, settling beside her uncle with the easy acceptance of childhood. Papa says she used to give away half our food to families that didn't have enough. Owen watched this reunion of sorts with emotions too complex to name. Part of him remained alert to the possibility of deception, ready to protect his daughter if Cain's surrender proved to be a ruse. But mostly, he felt overwhelming relief that this confrontation might end without more bloodshed, that Bethany might gain an uncle instead of losing a father. Tobias appeared in the doorway, his face grim but his weapon holstered. "Owen, we need to talk. There are some developments outside that you should know about." "What kind of developments?" "The kind that suggests James here isn't the only one who's been living a lie for the past 12 years. Owen felt his stomach clench with apprehension. "Meaning?" "Meaning there are 3 federal marshals outside who've been tracking this gang for the past 6 months. And they're not here because of the kidnapping." Sheriff Murdoch's face went pale. "They're here for Owen." "That's right. Seems those wanted posters weren't just psychological warfare. Someone with serious authority has been building a case against the Phantom for crimes that supposedly happened over the past 2 years. The implications crashed over Owen like a cold wave. Someone had been framing him systematically, creating evidence of crimes he'd never committed, building a legal case that would justify his execution as a dangerous fugitive. The kidnapping had been just one part of a larger strategy to destroy everything he'd built in Bitter Creek. Cain looked up from his correspondence with his father, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Owen." 3 months later, the morning sun painted Bitter Creek in the same shades of amber and gold that had welcomed so many peaceful dawns. But Owen Blackthorne stood in his corral with a different understanding of what peace truly meant. The bay mare he was working with, a new arrival, from a ranch outside Denver, responded to his gentle guidance with the kind of trust that came from recognizing strength tempered by wisdom. The wanted posters had all been removed, burned in a ceremonial fire that had included half the town and 3 very embarrassed federal marshals who'd spent 6 months chasing phantoms created by a bitter old judge's thirst for revenge. Judge Harold Hayes was now awaiting trial for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice, charges that would likely see him spending his final years in federal prison rather than his comfortable mansion in Colorado Springs. "Papa, you've got a letter from Uncle James," Bethany called from the front porch, where she sat on the new swing Owen had built, stronger and more comfortable than the old one, but positioned in exactly the same spot where she'd spent so many evenings learning to play her harmonica. Owen secured the mare's lead rope and walked over to accept the envelope. Noting the return address of the territorial prison in Santa Fe, James had surrendered himself to federal authorities after his testimony had cleared Owen's name, accepting responsibility for the crimes his gang had actually committed. The judge had been lenient, considering the circumstances, but James would still spend the next 5 years paying his debt to society. The letter was brief but warm, written in the careful script of a man who'd learned to value words, precisely because he'd spent so many years using them carelessly. "Dear Owen and Bethany, I hope this finds you both well and happy in your peaceful life. Prison is not pleasant, but it is giving me time to think about the man I want to be when I'm released, and about the family I want to help build rather than destroy. I've been corresponding with several families whose lives were disrupted by my gang's activities, trying to make what amends I can through letters and the small wages I earn in the prison workshop. It's not much, but Catherine always said that redemption began with accepting responsibility for the harm we've caused others. Bethany, I've enclosed a photograph of your mother when she was about your age, along with some stories I wrote down about her childhood. I hope they help you understand the remarkable woman who chose to build a life with your father, despite all the obstacles our family put in their way. Owen, I know I can never fully repay the debt I owe you for your mercy and forgiveness, but I want you to know that every day I spend in this place, I remember the choice you made to save me rather than destroy me. It's a lesson I carry with me as I try to become someone worthy of Catherine's love and your trust. Give my regards to Sheriff Murdoch, Doc Patterson, and all the good people of Bitter Creek who showed more Christian charity to a stranger than he deserved. Your brother, if you'll have me. James Owen folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his vest pocket next to the compass rose pendant that had finally been returned to Bethany after serving as evidence in the federal case. The photograph James had enclosed showed a young girl with auburn curls and mischievous green eyes, standing beside a garden gate with a book in her hands and a smile that could light up the darkest room. She looks like you, Owen told his daughter, handing her the photograph. She looks happy, Bethany replied, studying her mother's face with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail. Uncle James says in his letter that she used to read to the servants' children when their parents were working. That sounds like your mother. He also says he wants to come visit when he gets out of prison. If that's all right with us. Owen looked at his daughter, seeing Catherine's capacity for forgiveness in her young face, along with the strength that came from understanding that redemption was possible for anyone willing to change. What do you think, little bird? Should we have room for one more at our dinner table? I think families should stick together, Bethany replied, with the same authority she'd shown during the confrontation in Devil's Canyon. Even when they've made mistakes. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced a visitor. Sheriff Murdoch rode up to the fence line, dismounting with the easy grace of a man who'd found peace with his choices and his place in the world. Morning. Owen, Bethany. Murdoch tipped his hat to both of them, then pulled an official-looking envelope from his saddlebag. Got some news from the territorial capital you'll want to hear. Owen accepted the envelope with curiosity, breaking the wax seal to reveal a document bearing the official stamp of the territorial governor. As he read, his expression shifted from curiosity to surprise to something approaching wonder. What is it, Papa? It's a commendation, Owen said slowly, for services to the territory in the apprehension of a dangerous criminal gang and the exposure of judicial corruption. Meaning? Sheriff Murdoch grinned, meaning your father is officially a hero instead of a fugitive. There's even talk of appointing him as a territorial marshal if he's interested in the work. Owen looked from the commendation to his daughter to the peaceful life they'd built together in Bitter Creek. The offer was generous and would provide financial security for Bethany's future, but it would also mean returning to a world where violence was a daily reality and where the line between justice and vengeance was often measured in split-second decisions. What do you think, little bird? Should your old papa become a lawman? Bethany considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, weighing the benefits of security and official recognition against the values that had shaped their life together. I think you should do whatever makes you happy. Papa, but I also think the best way to keep people safe isn't always with guns and badges. Owen smiled, recognizing Catherine's wisdom in their daughter's words. You're right, as usual. Sheriff, please send my thanks to the governor, but tell him I'm honored to serve the territory right here in Bitter Creek, breaking horses and helping people remember that strength doesn't always have to mean violence. As Murdoch rode away with Owen's polite declination, father and daughter settled onto their front porch swing to watch the sun continue its journey across the sky. The rope was new, the seat was more comfortable, but the rhythm was the same as it had always been, a gentle back-and-forth motion that spoke of continuity and peace, and the precious ordinariness of life lived in harmony with one's neighbors. "Papa," Bethany said as they swayed together in the morning breeze, "do you ever think about what would have happened if Uncle James had succeeded? If he'd killed you and taken me away to live with grandfather?" Owen considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer would help shape his daughter's understanding of choices and consequences and the fragile nature of the happiness they'd built. "Together, I think about it sometimes," he admitted, "but not with regret and not with anger. I think about it with gratitude that we found a different path, that your uncle found the courage to choose redemption over revenge, and that families can heal even when they've been broken for a very long time, even our family. Especially our family." In the distance, the bay mare Owen had been working with whinnied softly, a sound of contentment that spoke of trust earned and fears overcome. It was a sound that captured everything Owen had tried to build in his years of peaceful living, the understanding that strength used wisely could heal rather than destroy, that patience could accomplish what violence never could, and that the greatest victories were often measured not by the enemies you defeated, but by the people you chose to save. The empty swing had become full again, but now it held not just a father and daughter, but the promise of a larger family built on forgiveness rather than blood, on choice rather than inheritance, on the radical notion that people could change and deserved the chance to prove it. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, and Bitter Creek came alive with the sounds of another day, Owen Blackthorne allowed himself to believe that the peace he'd found was real, lasting and worth every sacrifice he'd made to achieve it. The man known as the Phantom was truly dead and buried, replaced by someone better, a father, a neighbor, a teacher of horses and humans alike, and proof that redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to lay down their weapons and pick up something better. The swing creaked gently in the mountain breeze, its sound a lullaby of contentment that would echo through all their peaceful tomorrows.